Hello, folks. Welcome to the first Political Institutions and Political Economy workshop at the University of Southern California's Bedrosian Center for the spring semester of 2021. And we're going to do something different this semester, and I think it'll be a great success. And that is to have a formal discussion, a formal discussant identified for each paper or each presentation that's given. And today, the paper is Political Parties as Drivers of U.S. Polarization, 1927 to 2018, by Nathan Kanan, Chad Kendall, and Francesco Trebbi. Chad, my colleague at the USC Marshall School, is going to be presenting the paper. And as our discussant is Nolan McCarty at Princeton University. So for the attendees out there, if you want to ask a question, you can type it in the Q&A box. You can raise your hand, and I'll be monitoring each of those things, and I'll I guess determine at that time whether it's a question that requires me to break in and ask Chad to answer it at that point, or put it off until the end. And I guess without further ado, we'll turn it over to Chad. And this paper, remind me, Chad, as you introduce it, this is a follow-up to the paper the three of you just published in Econometrica.
That's correct. And I'll talk about the relationship in a few slides. So thanks very much, Jeff and the organizers for having me today. As Jeff said, this paper is joint with Nathan Kanan and Francesco Trebbi, who I think are both listening in. So we're going to be talking about polarization. And I think this is a perfect audience. So just the background that we have, we basically the first draft is brand new. So it's a perfect time to get your feedback. And I know there's a lot of experts on Congress here, so we're really curious to see what you guys all think. So with given recent events, I probably don't have to convince anyone that society is highly polarized. I mean, it's not a day goes by where we don't see some sort of new and more surprising thing about partisans of different parties acting in different ways. When we talk about polarization, we have to be a little bit clear what we're talking about. So we could talk about voters being polarized, and voter polarization you can actually think of in two ways. One is in terms of policies, liking very different policies. So that would be called perhaps policy polarization. And we can also think about affective polarization, which is just a dislike or a distaste for people of the other side. And I'm going to return to the connection to voter polarization in the conclusion. But really what this paper is focused on is elite polarization of the elites. And so here the evidence, so with voters, the evidence is, I would argue, a little bit more mixed. With elites, there's pretty much unambiguous evidence that elites are polarized. The evidence comes from surveys, it comes from measures of speech, comes from the donations they get, and it comes from roll call votes, which is going to be our focus today. So when we think about roll call votes, the picture that might come to mind is the picture at the bottom here. And this is coming from the popular DW nominate, which is a scoring method of basically placing members of Congress on a line you can think of in a spatial dimension. And it's plotting the distance between the median Republican and median Democrat as a function of time for both the House and Senate. And you get this kind of typical U-shaped pattern where very recently, it was polarized back in the early 1900s, and then now we're very polarized again. So we're going to try to say something about new to this literature on polarization of elites. And let me just mention that we also there's increasing evidence that polarization matters. It's not just a matter of these numbers moving apart in some econometric model. It matters for gridlock, economic uncertainty. If we're flipping back and forth between parties every time there's a new election, that's going to create a lot of uncertainty. It's also been associated with inequality. So what we're going to try and do in this paper is think about what is the source of that polarization of elites. And when we think about the fact that Democrats and Republicans vote very differently, and very cohesively within the party. This could be due to a couple of things. It could be due to the fact that they actually, so members of each party actually are very different ideologically. They just like different policy positions. Or it could be due to the strength of parties. So what we're going to call party discipline or whipping. So we know that like the sort of the second in command in sort of the hierarchy of party leadership is the whip typically, and the whip's job is to whip members. So the whip's job is to make sure that members vote the way the party wants, either with incentives, either the carrot or the stick kind of thing. And so it's been well known that these things are difficult to separate, simply because if you see all the Democrats vote in the same way, it could be that the Democratic leadership has convinced them all to vote that way, or it could be that they're all ideologically similar. Of course, because of course you'd expect people with the same ideology to kind of coalesce into the same party. And then lastly, it could be that the parties are only going to pursue bills on which the party themselves agree. If there's a bunch of disagreement between members, perhaps they say, let's not take this bill to a vote. And why do we think this is important? Well, the source is important because if the story is about, so if the story of increased polarization is just that voters are electing more and more extreme members, and that's why they're moving apart over time, then perhaps there's little that can be done about it. Perhaps there's nothing we want to do about it in that case. Whereas if it's really about party power, maybe it'd be more amenable to change. So for example, we could maybe change some of the institutional rules to try to reduce the power that parties have. So what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to take a standard discrete choice model. So members of Congress are just going to vote for the policy alternative or not, in which case they're effectively voting for the status quo. And we're going to augment it with a party discipline parameter. So we're going to have a role for parties to whip their members within the model. And it's going to be modeled with multidimensional ideological preferences. So in particular, it's going to allow for 2 dimensions. And in the paper, we're going to allow for a very general agenda setting model. So where the policy that we're voting on comes from can be very general. We're going to formally prove identification of the ideological parameters and the discipline parameters using the data on votes alone. So just using data on votes, and through the data on votes, also the leadership positions. So we're also going to get the leadership. How do the leaders, what would the leaders like on this particular bill from the way that they vote on the bill? And then we're going to estimate it for the US Congress for both the House and Senate from 1927 to 2018. And let me just briefly mention why we don't go back before 1927. It's just a little bit harder to go back before that because the concept of leadership is not so clear before that. So it's harder to get this measure of what do the leaders want to do. So in terms of within the context of the literature, I mean, there's a huge literature on estimating these kind of spatial models of where voters sit in an ideological space. And there's a large literature on polarization. So this is not a complete list here, and I won't go through any in particular, but just to say that there's a very broad literature. More specifically related to what we're doing are the few papers that have tried to tease out this idea of what role do parties play. And what we're adding here is sort of a well-identified general framework that can be used in basically any setting in which you have vote data to try and get at the party effect. And so, as Jeff mentioned before we started, this is part of a research agenda. So we have a previous paper that we recently published, which I actually presented in this workshop a couple years ago. So all this might be sounding very familiar. So what is different in that previous paper? The question was the same. We were trying to figure out whether parties were important. And to get at that, we were using what's called whip count data. So we were using the data on how members said they were going to vote in addition to how they actually voted. And the intuition there was by looking at how they move, if they move towards what the party wanted, that's going to give us a measure of how much wrangling was going on. So how much discipline there was. The So that paper showed that parties are important, but it showed it for a very narrow of time. So basically 5 Congresses, 1977 to 86, because that's the only time that we have the whip count data available. It was also focused on a single dimension, which in this paper, we're going to try and go over time. So it's going to be more important to allow for multiple dimensions, because we know, for example, like in the civil rights era, that a second dimension is probably important. So that previous paper raises a lot of questions. How has discipline evolved if you think about over time? Has it changed? What does it look like recently? Are parties stronger now or weaker now? And when we account for discipline, does it change how we think about how ideological polarization, that is the distance between the median Republican Democrat, how that has changed over time? Does it still have this U shape that I showed you on the first slide, or does it look differently? And then, as I mentioned, the other thing that we want to account for in this paper is a second dimension. So the key things for the new paper are, relative to that paper, is we're going to allow for a second dimension, and we're going to be able to do things without the whip count data, which again makes it much more general. So just to preview the results, I'm going to show you that discipline is significant in every Congress. So we're going to allow this key discipline parameter that we're estimating to change Congress by Congress. It's going to be statistically and quantitatively significant in every Congress going back to 1927. And roughly we can say, if we think about the polarization in votes, how much of it we're going to try and decompose it into how much is due to discipline, how much is due to actual ideological separation. We'll say 65 to 75% of the most recent polarization is due to discipline. So it's a good chunk of what's going on. We're also going to find that ideological polarization monotonically increases over time, in contrast to the U shape I showed you that comes from DW nominate on the first slide. So we're going to try and think about why there's a difference there. And then lastly, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on robustness, because I think it's going to be important that we're going to have to make some assumptions, in particular about what bills are being whipped and not whipped. And so I'm going to show you that we can make a variety of assumptions and get essentially the same results. So nothing is going to hinge on one particular assumption. Okay, so let me jump right into the model. So it's a standard random utility model where the members are going to vote for one of two policies, and they're going to have unbounded shocks. So you can think of DW nominate. It's essentially a standard model with this a couple of little tricks to make things easier to identify, and the addition of party discipline. So there's going to be two parties. We'll call them R and D. You can think of Republican and Democrat. They're going to compete for votes over a series of bills. Members are going to sit in a two-dimensional ideological space. So you imagine a 2D plane, and each member is located at some theta in each of the two dimensions. And they're going to have preferences over policies given by this utility function here. What does this utility function say? It essentially says that what they care about is the difference between their bliss point, the theta, and the policy itself. So this the bars here are indicating the Euclidean norm. So think about the distance between the two. Except that we're going to allow the shocks you can think of them in utility shocks, are going to act on the ideologies. And there's going to be a role for parties through this YIT. So YIT is how much is the party rewarding a member for voting, a member I for voting the way that the party wants. And all we need to assume about this utility function is that it's monotonically decreasing. So we don't need to assume quadratic, but we need to assume that the farther away policies are, the worse they are for you as a voter. So what does this translate to when you think about how the voter is going to, so a member of Congress is going to vote? They're going to be choosing between the proposed alternative, which we'll call X, and the status quo Q, which again are in two-dimensional space. So they're located in two-dimensional space. Well, they're going to choose X if it gives a higher utility than Q, which, because of this assumption of monotonicity of the utility function, is just going to mean that X is closer to theta than Q. So this means that we can essentially think of what's called a cut line. So this dotted line on the bottom graph on the right here is the cut line. It's going to separate all the members into two parts. So for example, those above, here it's mostly Democrats, those above might be voting yes, and those below are going to vote no. So there's going to be a cut line that's going to have a slope, M, and an intercept, B, and everybody above is going to vote yes, and everybody below is going to vote no, or the opposite, right? No could be up, and yes could be down. So that's without whipping. I'll talk about with whipping in a moment. So what are the key assumptions we're making here? First, we're assuming that shocks are ideological. So this is a little bit different than the standard thing where you have a utility shock. It's conceptually, it's the same. It's just whether you have the shock acting inside the utility function or outside. But what this does for us is two things. One, it means we don't have to specify the utility function. So we don't have to assume it's quadratic, for example. And we don't have to, we won't estimate the X and the Q. So we won't have to estimate those two policy positions for every bill. Instead, we only have to estimate a cut line and a direction. Is yes above the cut line or below? So this saves one parameter per bill, which is actually important in getting consistent estimates and being able to identify the model. We're going to assume shocks move ideal points orthogonally to the cut line. So if you have a member and you have a cut line, the shock's going to move them in the way that's most likely to switch their vote. And this is just the kind of the simplest thing you could think of. You could have more complicated two-dimensional shocks, but you're going to end up with essentially a similar likelihood function. This is just the easiest way to do it. Standard assumption, the shocks are unbounded and realized after the policy is set. So there's some status quo. The proposing party chooses an alternative X, all that's set, and then the members look at the bill and decide which way they're going to want to vote, and that's going to be subject to some idiosyncratic preferences on that particular bill. The fact that it's set before the shocks and that the shocks are unbounded means that we don't actually have to specify the agenda setting. So we show in the paper that for a very general agenda setting model, you're going to be able to identify and estimate everything without assuming anything specific. And the idea is, because we're going to estimate this cut line, the rough intuition is because we're going to estimate this cut line, it doesn't really matter where the cut line came from. And then lastly, about whipping. So we're going to assume that the whips are actually bearing the cost of disciplining members. And what this essentially leads to is that there's no budget for the party. So they're not concerned about using up their incentives or something on this bill versus another one. The whips are there. They're the ones putting in the effort. Their job is to convince people. And so they have to put in costly effort to convince people, and they get rewarded for doing so. So what this is going to mean is that we're going to have, who are the whips going to want to whip? Well, it's going to be the ones close to the cut line. So I'll show you that on the next picture here. So previously we had this single cut line, the dotted cut line. Now there's going to be two. And so all the people, so imagine here that yes is up and no is down. So the Democrats want this bill to pass. So they're going to be able to influence all these members in here. These are the ones of the Democrats, not, they can't whip the other party, but of the Democratic members in that range that would have said no, they're going to be able to convince them to yes.
You want to go outside? Are you ready to go outside, people?
And so this YD max parameter is that's our measure of discipline. How far into their members can the Democrats go? Can they pull really extreme guys out here, or they can only move the people really close to the margin? Similarly for Republicans, if they're whipping for no in this case, then all the members in here are the ones that would have said yes, and they're going to get convinced to say no. So so these two parameters, YR max for Republicans and YD max for Democrats, are the key measures of discipline. And just again, it's how strong are they? Who can they influence? Everybody, or only those that are close to switching anyway? So the model then gives us a probability for each legislator of voting yes, conditional on the policies and the discipline parameters. I'm not going to worry about this functional form too much here, but it depends on whether yes is up or down, which is actually another parameter we have to estimate. So for every bill, we have to estimate whether yes is pointing up or down. And it depends on the bliss points, of course, in 2 dimensions. It depends on the cut line, and it depends on the whipping directions. That's what this WP, T thing is. That's the direction on this bill that the party's whipping. And that we're going to get from the data, knowing that how the leader voted. So if the leader says yes, then they were probably whipping to try to get people to vote yes. So our goal is to estimate the ideologies, the cut point parameters, that is the slope and intercept, the B and the M, the directions, so is yes up or down for every bill, and the discipline parameters. So for identification, we're going to make several assumptions. Most of them are basically just the standard assumptions you would have to make. So let me just mention them and the intuition behind them quickly. So we first have to assume that the ideal points are not perfectly collinear for at least one party. That is, we don't have both parties' members sitting on a line. And the reason is if the members were all sitting on a line, well, then you'd have a one-dimensional model. And if that's the true model, there's no way you could estimate where they sit in the second dimension, because they don't. You would just get noise. So we have to assume there are 2 dimensions. Let me just jump to the third one and come back. So we're going to assume that there's a bill that has a slope of 0 and some other bill that doesn't have a slope of 0. The one that doesn't, so the fact that we need 2 different slopes is, again, because if all the slopes were the same, then it would be a unidimensional world. We wouldn't be able to identify 2 dimensions. Jumping back to the second assumption, we're going to assume somebody sits at 0, 0, and there's another politician K that sits at known first dimension, but vertically can move around. Combining that with there exists a bill such that the slope of 0 is just purely a normalization thing. So when you estimate a 2-dimensional model, you can obviously rotate everything around without changing the probabilities. So by pinning somebody at 0, 0 and a slope of 0, all we're doing is pinning down that rotation. So you have to have some such normalization. And also, of course, you could shift it around. So the 0, 0 prevents it from shifting around. And then the last assumption is the critical one for our discipline. We're going to assume that the 2 parties whip in the same direction on at least one bill and in opposite directions on at least another bill. And this is going to be the thing that allows us to individually identify the discipline parameters. I'm going to show you that here. So on the left is the picture I showed you before, where the Democrats are whipping in one direction, so they're pulling all their members this way, and the Republicans are pulling all their members the other way. So you can see then that the distance between the cut lines of the 2 parties is related to the sum of the Ymax parameters. Now, what happens when they whip in opposite directions? So that when they whip in opposite directions, the difference between the cut line parameters is it's the difference between the discipline parameters. So now if you imagine the equations, and I'm simplifying a little bit, there's the sum in one case and there's a difference in the other case. Those are linearly independent, and so you can identify both parameters individually. So in the baseline model, we're going to assume that all bills are whipped. So if the 2 parties leaderships are saying opposite things, then they're whipping against each other. If they both say yes, then everybody's trying to get their members to move towards yes on that bill. Now, you might reasonably say, well, that's pretty strong. Wouldn't you think there's a bunch of bills where they don't whip because everybody agrees anyway? So we're going to consider a couple of alternatives. The first is going to be, well, if the 2 leaders both say yes or no, then there's no whipping. Then, the parties agree there's going to be no whipping on those bills. Or taking a cue from Snyder and Grosclose, when the bills are very lopsided, there's no whipping. That's going to be another alternative model. Those 2 things sound similar. They're not exactly the same, because just because the leaders agree doesn't mean the bill is going to be lopsided or conversely. The data comes from VoteView. So very nicely, the VoteView website has constructed this historical records of the roll call data, and they made it very easy to download. So that's super useful for us. We get the whipping direction from the leadership votes. So if the leader says, If the leader of the Democrats says yes, then we're going to assume that the Democrats wanted the bill to pass. In cases where we don't know the leader's vote, we're going to use the whip's vote, being that they're kind of second in command. And in the rare instances where we don't know the leader or the whip, because they're both missing for some reason, we're going to use the majority of the party. So that's how we construct the direction that the leader of each party was whipping for. In the results for today, I'm just going to talk about the 2D Senate. In the paper, we have 1D House and Senate. We don't have the 2D House yet because the number of bills and the number of members is so much bigger for the House that we actually need a little bit more powerful computer than we have at the moment. But conceptually, we can do it the same way we've done the others. The figure on the bottom here is just showing the number of roll calls over time and also broken down by when they whip opposite directions versus when they both say yes. And this is just showing, one, that we have a lot of data, and two, that we have the variation we need. So they do say, they do whip and they do say opposite things in some cases, and they say the same thing in other cases. Okay, so results. So what we're plotting here is this key parameter. This is the main result of the paper. We're plotting the Y max. So how far can the Democrats, how much reach do they have within their members? And same for the Republicans. So the filled blue dots are the Democrats, and the open red dots are the Republicans. And then we're just plotting a sort of a smooth curve through each of them to see kind of the trend. So first thing to note is all of these are, well, you can't tell from the graph, but all of these parameters are statistically significant. So this is statistically different from 0 in every Congress. And we get this kind of U shape where where it's kind of low in kind of the mid 60s, the civil rights kind of time period, and we're at an all-time high recently. When we look at polarization, so this is the same as the picture I showed you on the first slide for DW nominate. So I'm plotting the distance between the median Republican and median Democrat as a function of time. And we see here that the U shape is gone now. So we basically just see monotonically increasing ideological polarization. Meaning the previous story that, yes, we're polarized now, but we were also polarized in the early 20s is the story for us changes a little bit. It's we're polarized now in a way that we never were before in terms of talking about the actual ideological distance between the parties. We can try to decompose if the votes, so there's polarization in votes, how did the parties, how much did they actually vote differently, into two parts. How far apart are they ideologically, and how much is due to like discipline. Here we're using, we're still working on this, but here we're using the measure that we had from our previous paper, which is based on a theoretical result for one dimension that says, you know, it's just a shift. So if you ignore discipline, you're going to shift them farther apart than they should be, because you're going to attribute difference in votes to ideology, because you have nothing else to attribute it to if you don't have discipline. So by this measure, we see about 75%. When we look at our 1D results, it's about 65%. So there's a substantial part of the polarization is due to discipline. And again, we're still trying to figure out what's the best way to decompose this. DW nominate, there's been some talk, if you look at the results, about asymmetric polarization. So what they mean by that is, so here I'm just plotting the median members, so not the distance between them, but the median members as a function of time. And so in DW nominate, there's often the talk about the Republicans moving right, but the Democrats not moving left very much. In our results, it's actually more symmetric. So so the Republicans, which is this one, are in fact moving right, and the Democrats are moving left by almost the same amount, pretty much the same amount. So I promised to show you some other model results. So we can re-estimate everything under the assumption that there's no whipping. So our main results are the solid line, and then the blue dashed line is no whipping on lopsided bills. So as in Snyder grows close. I can't see it. The red dashed line, I think, is no whipping when the two leaders agree. And then the last one I didn't mention before, the other one we're showing here is you may be concerned that our measure of what the party wants is not great. So in particular, if the leader says one thing and the whip says something else, maybe it's ambiguous as to what that party wants. So we can just drop those votes and it doesn't change much. So what I'm plotting here is, as a function of time, I'm plotting the sum of the discipline parameters. So y max d plus y max r. And the reason for that is when in the model where there's no whipping when the opposing leaders agree, we can't actually identify the two parameters separately because we need them voting in the same direction on some bills and opposite directions on the other bills. So if we assume no whipping when they agree, then we can only get the sum. So the takeaway here is the sum of the disciplines doesn't change much under what I would argue are very, very different assumptions about which bills are being whipped and not whipped. For the three models that we can decompose, the y max d from the y max r, that's what I'm plotting here. Basically the results are very, very similar across the models. So an obvious question is, what about, how do your results compare to DW nominate? So here what I'm plotting is our estimate on the x-axis and DW nominate's estimate on the y-axis in the first dimension. So I'm comparing first dimension ideologies across the two. Now, one thing to mention is the rotation of both of these models is arbitrary. So the first thing we have to do is rotate ours to match as closely as possible DW nominates to make the comparison valid. And that's something called the Procrustes transformation, so we've done that here. So what does this say? This says that the correlation is very good. So like along the first dimension, our estimates and DW nominates line up quite well, except for this wedge here. So what's going on here? This is party discipline. So we would say there's a bunch of members sitting at 0, and DW nominate would say, no, they don't sit at 0. The Republicans sit a little bit right and the Democrats sit a little bit left. And that's again because having not accounted for party discipline, they're going to load the difference in voting on differences in ideologies. And we're going to say, no, they're ideologically more similar, but they're being disciplined in different ways. So in the first dimension, it correlates very well. In the second dimension, the correlation is very poor, as you can see. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but just looking at the scatter plot, you can see that the correlation is close to 0. So why is this? What's the difference between us and DW nominate in the second dimension? Well, the first thing that might come to mind is maybe it has something to do with party discipline. That's not the case. We can re-estimate our model without party discipline, just forcing the y max parameters to be 0. Again, there's basically no correlation along the second dimension. Another way to compare the two models is to look at polarization. So ours is the monotonically increasing over time, and then this U shape is just the replication of what I showed you from the first slide for DW nominate. But I should mention one thing. Here, what we did is this is the re-estimated model without party discipline. So even without party discipline, we're going to say polarization is monotonically increasing over time. It doesn't have this U shape. So there's differences between our results and DW nominates, both in terms of this trend in polarization and in terms of how the second dimensions correlate. So what is going on here? Well, we think that the main difference between our model and DW nominate is that we have a formally proven identified model. In the paper, we show that DW nominate is not identified, even absent parties. And to be specific, what we show in the paper is that you can transform all the ideologies in DW nominate in a non-rotational way. So it's not just a rotation, which we know you could always rotate. It's a non-rotational way of translating all the members, and that's going to mess with the correlations, the rank order in both dimensions. So basically, you can come up with a transformation where you can make the members rank very differently along each dimension. So we think then what DW nominate is doing kind of historically to get consistent results is they're using information from outside the model, and there's some there's some writings about that in the DW nominated literature about this idea that Keith Poole was kind of what they quote unquote called the outer loop. He used his knowledge of where members should sit to kind of pin things down. And if you pin down enough people, then you can get consistent estimates, even if things are not identified. Okay, so just to conclude, parties matter both statistically and quantitatively. So in the pre-war period, parties were of moderate strength, ideologies were not very polarized. 1960s, we got kind of this low party strength. And today we're sitting in a time of both unprecedented discipline and ideological polarization. So our take is this means this polarization is not all about voters electing extremists. In fact, the timing of the uptick sort of starting mid 80s and coming up kind of suggests that things might even go another way. And here we're speculating a little bit, but there's this idea that starting in kind of the mid 80s, parties started to use these strategies of using, for example, very divisive language to talk about the the policies and the other party. And maybe this is actually, so this coherence of the parties being strong and starting to use these tools has actually driven effective polarization. So in talking about the other elites in a bad way, voters have picked up on that. The last thing I'll mention is that because we have this time series of discipline, we can also test theories of party behavior. And I'll just close with, we do a few things in the paper, but I'll just close with one story that's kind of consistent with what we find. And that's what's called conditional party government. So conditional party government, the basic idea is that when parties are very homogeneous, when all your members look alike, you want to delegate authority to leaders so that they can coordinate things. On the other hand, when you're very heterogeneous, you don't want to delegate to the leaders because the leader might want to do something differently than what you want to do. So what we're doing here is we're plotting the variance within party of the ideologies in the first dimension over time. And the interesting thing we see is that the variance is really high in the civil rights era, which is what you'd expect. That's when, we think there was a second dimension that was important. But that's also precisely when we get the low point in discipline. So there seems to be this negative correlation between when party members are very heterogeneous, discipline's low, and conversely. Like so recently, it's more homogeneous and discipline is very high. So this again is consistent with this conditional party government story. In the paper, we think about some other theories. How'd I do? Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chad. Okay, so we have Nolan McCarty, who is going to share some of his slides as well.
I'm really thankful for the opportunity to talk about this paper. As was mentioned, it's the first draft of a paper, which is a follow-up to an earlier paper, which was very successful. There's a few things about the paper that I think are very important that I'm not going to talk very much about. The first is the issues of identification of the two-dimensional model. I think it's a very important issue. It's kind of a technical one, and although I'm going to talk about some technical ones, I just won't be able to get into here. But for those so inclined to pay attention to it, they should. The second important thing that's in the paper is almost kind of a throwaway, which is the invariance of these estimates to agenda effects. There's a lot of confusion in the literature about what agenda effects should do to ideal point estimates, and this paper, in a very small section, does a lot to help clarify what I think is the correct position. So, just highlighting two things I'm not going to talk very much about. Instead, I'm going to talk about assumptions about the covariance of error terms. So I said I would talk about some technical things, but I think it's very important in understanding how we can and maybe not want to interpret this paper. So a central feature of DW nominated and almost all the other scaling methodologies that are related to it is that what we might call the stochastic component of voting, or in this paper, the stochastic component of ideal points, or IID, identically independently distributed, conditional on the cut point and the other roll call parameters. So that's a very, very strong assumption. We often make the even stronger assumption that the variances are the same, so the covariance of all the errors is just the diagonal symmetric matrix. And the reason why we make this assumption is nobody wants to, for the house anyway, I mean, I guess in this paper it's 100 by 100, but nobody wants to estimate a 435 by 435 covariance matrix. We don't really have enough data. So you have to make some simplifying assumptions about the covariances, and the tradition has been to make the simplest one possible, but it's obviously wrong. It's obviously a wrong assumption. There's lots of reasons why IID might be violated. We can imagine geographical constituency effects, such that members in similar geographies or similar constituencies would have their errors correlated so that their voting would shift together in tandem across issues. The literature also tends to recognize that the one or even two-dimensional model is a projection from a large multi-dimensional model down to a lower dimension. And so the extent to which there are small unmodeled preference dimensions, that's going to induce positive covariances across members. We can think about, personal connections among members. There are papers like, if two members have a desk close to each other, do they tend to vote with each other or not? So we have those. And then, of course, party is going to be a major source of correlation in these error terms, but it may do so independently of whether it's actually party discipline, party whipping, as described in this paper, or a variety of other reasons why the error terms across partisans are going to be highly correlated. So to kind of show why, I think this makes difference and why, may contribute to some of the results here, I'm going to go through a very toy formalization of the problem, and I'm going to give you just one version, simplified version model, which I'll call it the right-oriented one-dimensional linear model, which is just one in which we're going to assume that, the latent utilities of voting yes are just a function, increasing function of the ideal point. So this is the situation in which the alternative lies to the right of the status quo. That's what I mean by right-oriented. So it's an increasing function of the ideal point, a decreasing function of the cut point, the point of indifference between the new alternative and the status quo, plus an error term in time t for legislator I and vote J. Okay. So I'm just going to talk about two members. So think about member one as maybe the leader, the person we've identified as the leader, and just legislator two is just somebody else. So let's assume that IID is violated so that the correlation between the error terms across the members for every vote, let's say, is just row T. And then by kind of very simple, results. Then the model for legislators 1 and 2. Actually, this is for legislator 2. Forget 1. This is the model for legislator 2. Is just again their ideal point minus the cut point times the correlation times the error term for the leader for the first legislator plus a new zero mean IID error term. But that implies something like the following, which is if we know, may not know the realization of legislator 1's shock, but if we know the direction of it, we're going to get something like this, such that the vote, the latent vote utility is going to be when the shock is positive, we're going to add row to their ideal point. When the shock is negative, we're going to subtract row from the ideal point. Okay, so my point here is that this starts to look a lot like the whipping model, where every vote is whipped. If what the realization of the leader's position means is it telling you the direction, it is telling you the direction of a party-specific shock, then we're going to get something like when the leader votes yes, it's going to, that part of the shock is going to be positive and everybody's more likely to vote yes. When the leader votes no, it's going to imply that more likely than not, the party-specific shock is negative and that people are more likely to vote for the status quo. So this issue of whether or not the results are due to the party strategy of whipping or whether they're due to party-specific correlations is really important for the interpretation of the results. So, you know, where my partisan covariances come from, you know, in addition to the discipline narrowly defined as in this paper, well, they could arise from a variety of places. You know, one, as I've already mentioned, the role of partisan geography and constituencies. We know there's a strong correlation between at the party level between geography and constituencies. So
Francesco is asking on the previous slide whether those two things just cancel out on average.
Maybe I did the math. They really yeah, I think E minus should actually be minus the expectation. Because if we know, I mean, forget the math, just think of the logic. If we know that the shock is positive, everybody's more likely to vote yes. If we know the shock's negative, everybody's more likely to vote no. So I may have missed a sign somewhere in the math. My apologies. So, you know, we can imagine that. We might also imagine something that's kind of missing from a lot of the models is that there might be variations in the polarization of an issue. There just might be things in the political environment which make some issues more polarized than others. So we expect that when, you know, one member of the party tends to vote yes, that's going to be correlated with other members of the party voting yes and no. And then we worry about outside actors like partisan donor networks in media. Now, it's important to note that I'm not suggesting that these supplant the role of discipline as defined in this paper. I think of these primarily as complements to discipline. So part of the challenge really might be to kind of tease these out differently, separately. Okay. So that's one concern, and I'll come back to it at the end to talk about some suggestions about possible placebos to rule them out, as well as perhaps ways of kind of decomposing. The second issue I have with the paper, this one is more kind of conceptual, and that is kind of what is polarization. So the paper takes a bifurcation of polarization as being either polarization or party discipline, and so they call polarization the difference in the median and ideal point. Now that's consistent with the literature on polarization because in a world in which you're not measuring party discipline, our measure of the aggregate behavior of the parties is the median or mean or some other central tendency of the parties and how it differs from some other central tendency of the other party. But I think in general, when we talk about party polarization specifically in political economy, we mean something about the aggregate behaviors of the party and not just simply some kind of central tendency or order statistic of the individual preferences, but how the party behaves as an organization. So I think, you know, that rather than thinking of polarization as being the difference in the means of preference, that's an important component of it. That it should also be something that kind of reflects party discipline. And here, you know, I think, you know, what we want to take into account is that sometimes party discipline is moving Republican votes to the right, which is a polarizing move. Sometimes party discipline is moving Republican votes to the left, which is a depolarizing move. So the contribution of the Republicans party to polarization should be something like the median ideal point. And then the proportion of times that discipline moves their behavior to the right, minus the proportion of times that party discipline moves their behavior to the left. And that the Democratic contribution to polarization should be the median of the ideal points, or the mean of the ideal points, minus the number of times in which party discipline moves policy to the right in a depolarizing way, plus the amount of time that party discipline moves the behavior to the left in a depolarizing way. Okay, so I think there's not a criticism of the paper, but I think when people think about polarization aggregate, we shouldn't so quickly separate discipline from party preferences. Where I do think the paper might consider in its presentation, though, is using the same logic to think about the share of polarization that is due to party discipline. And again, taking into account that sometimes the party discipline is polarizing when Republicans whip people to the right and Democrats whip people left, and sometimes it's depolarizing. So this will actually, maybe not by much, I don't know, reduce the proportion of polarization in the figures that Chad showed before. I'll just talk about 2 minutes. I don't have a whole lot of time. I just want to make some kind of comments about some of the results and some of the interesting things about them and some of the things that may need a little bit more thinking about whether they're right. So one of the things that I think political scientists will find a little surprising is just the stark similarity in the levels and trends of party discipline across the two parties. Will Rogers once said he didn't belong to an organized political party because he was a Democrat. So there's long been a notion, whether it's true or not, I'm not saying it's true, the one party is just better organized than the other party. During the period of the civil rights era, which we see two-dimensional politics, and we argue that the Democrats should be more hindered in their ability to discipline members. We actually only see quite a fairly small difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. So again, that may be correct, but I think that deserves some interrogation. And this is one of the things I love, because I actually think it's actually true. But I love the fact that LBJ underperformed his GOP counterparts. I guess that Eb Dirksen didn't have as good a biographer as LBJ, but it appears that he was a more effective majority leader based on these estimates. A big part of the paper, as Chad mentioned, has to do with the kind of the lack of the U-shape. And there's no doubt that there are differences in the trajectories of kind of member polarization, if you will. I kind of like to see the measure of total polarization as I defined it before. But one of the things that's really worth noting, though, is the big collapse that makes the U really stand out is what happened between 1900 and 1925. So we don't have that. I'm not saying it'd be hugely different, but I do think that's one of the difficulties here, is that at precisely the time where we can really distinguish between substantively between the two models, we lose the period in which polarization was really high before. Again, I've already made my point about this picture. I mean, I think it should be lower once you take into account the broader definition of polarization. And then the interesting point the paper's made about the sort of absence of asymmetric polarization. I guess if you I guess if you sort of take as the kind of benchmark, what's happened since the 1980s, that is true. But I do think it's really striking, worth pointing out the kind of really a sharp right turn of the Republican Party, which is really what the emphasis on the of asymmetric polarization has been, is that the Republican Party really changed itself in kind of fundamental ways in the 1980s that the Democratic Party didn't. So the fact that both parties are moving to the left by these measures, and then one of them stops doing that and starts moving to the right, may be technically inconsistent with what people say about asymmetric polarization, but in of itself shows a very important asymmetry that's important not to get lost here. So let me just say, I said placebo suggestions. So this is to get back to the first issue about the correlations. Some of these are placebo. Some of these I think are perhaps just to sort of help secure the interpretation as a fact party discipline. But one of the things that I would suggest, and this is kind of consistent with Cox and McCubbin's, and you do this as one of the robustness checks anyway. But I would really suggest using whip and leader vote together as a measure of the party's position, and kind of leave out those cases in which they don't vote together and treat those as undisciplined. I think that gets around some of the issues that I raised, because you have you have the unwhipped votes there together, and I think it also gets around, and I didn't make a slide on this, but essentially because of the assumption that every vote is whipped, or almost every vote is whipped. The identification of the ideal point comes from the fact that you observe essentially one ideal point for a legislator when he's whipped in a right-wing direction, and one ideal point for when they're whipped in a left-wing direction. And then you assume symmetry so that the ideal point is the midpoint between those two ideal points, unless I missed something fundamental. Having a situation where leadership's divided and we don't expect whip would actually kind of break that up a little bit, maybe allow you to look at asymmetric effects and not have to kind of assume that the actual ideal point's in the middle of the whipped right versus whipped left position. Another thing I would suggest, again, we want to make sure, because we want to make sure that it's actually leaders and leadership that's doing the work, and not just pure correlation. I think just sampling placebo leaders, drawing from the distribution of ideal points, a leader, and saying, okay, for today, Louis Gohmert, you're the leader. let's use your votes to anchor this model. And then if there's big differences in the party effects that you get, then you're good. If you get very similar results for somebody who's obviously not a leader, then I would be a little bit more concerned. Another suggestion might be, because the way the model works, you're always going to get an ideal point for the lead, an ideal point for the leader, and then a cut point. Then you can predict which way the leader would vote. Then you might use that rather than their observed vote, and so it might help purge slightly any contemporaneous party specific shock. I haven't thought through whether that works at all technically, but that's just another suggestion. And then the last thing I'll suggest here is to look at some sensitivity of the estimates for party discipline to the relationship of the ideal point of the leader to the rest of the party. In cases where the leaders are kind of in the middle of their party, we expect their shocks to be more just informative of party-specific shocks, and which might inflate the party discipline measure. when they're more extreme relative to the party, then there's going to be a pure disciplining effect, probably less of just providing information about a party specific shock. You might also, if it's possible, I mean, I know the models have a lot of parameters and very difficult to estimate as it is, just simply see whether or not the estimate of Y max covariates with the distance between a member and their leader, or covariates between geographic similarities or differences from the leader, et cetera, again, to try to control for what might be a kind of a contemporaneous party-specific shock rather than a discipline effect. Okay, so that's all I have. It's it's a great paper. I look forward to seeing how it develops, and I recommend that everyone take a look.
Thanks, Nolan. So Chad, I've added Francesco and Nathan as panelists as well. So do you guys want to respond at all to anything Nolan said?
Chad, do you want to respond?
Yeah, let me start. First of all, thanks, Nolan. I mean, those are really, really good comments. I definitely can't respond to all of them because they're all very thought-provoking. So let me, and then maybe Francesco or Nathan want to take the other ones. But I mean, this idea of the correlated shocks, to be honest, I hadn't thought about it in the context of this paper. Anyway, in an interesting aside, I have another paper that's all about correlated shocks. But so here, what I'm trying to think about is exactly how you would. So what's the point of our paper? So we're trying to disentangle ideology from a party disciplining kind of force, right? Once you conceptually allow for a correlated shock, say within party, like all the party is going to move the same way independent of discipline. I mean, so conceptually, I get that. From an identification point of view, there'd be absolutely no way to disentangle those things. But nevertheless, I think it's an important thing to think about. What I'm trying to think about is what exactly the correlated shocks would be, because you gave some examples, but it has to be conditional on the ideology, remember? So conditional on having already pinned down where everybody sits. So the party, is all going to sit similarly because they vote similarly. So something like a geography, right? You've already accounted for geography conceptually with where you've placed them ideologically. So you need some kind of correlated shock conditional on the ideology, and it's less obvious to me where that would come from, although it's not impossible. And then that relates to some of the things you suggested at the end, and try to get around these. To try to figure out whether it is kind of these common shocks or really the leader. I really like the idea of placebo leader. I mean, because votes are so correlated, I would imagine that we're still going to pick up something discipline, but it should be smaller. It should be. You're right. It should be smaller. So I like that idea. Just off the top of my head, unless I'm missing something. And the predicted leaders vote similarly. I would have to think about that one more. I don't know how well that's, you're using a prediction out of something you've already estimated. I'd have to think it through a little bit. So that's on the correlated shock. I like that. I think we do need to think more about that. I think that's a very good point. And the other thing I'll comment on, and then I'll let my co-authors jump in, is the measure of polarization. So, I mean, first of all, so we just took the standard one, right? And at least that's a good starting point for us, because one of the points we're making is like, look, DW nominate says they're this far apart. We're saying they're this far apart. So we do want to make that comparison. But I totally take your point on when we're thinking about the share of polarization, that we might need to think about that. We might need to think about polarization differently, because it's just kind of fundamentally weird if you're talking about polarization as a distance and then trying to attribute that to one or the other. So we've been thinking about some measures like maybe using counterfactual unity scores or counterfactual vote shares. So like how different did they actually vote? And if you counterfactually take out discipline, how much would that shrink? That would be I think that would be something along the lines of kind of the things you were suggesting. So that I totally agree there, and that's something we're still thinking about. Francesco, Nathan.
So I would like to just Nolan, that was a remarkable presentation, not just in terms of like content, but also in terms of style. It's just a classy presentation because it's like we are total outsiders in this thing, and it was a totally thank you. So about the content, so the correlated shocks, let's think about it a little bit, okay? Because this is an issue that is easily resolvable. When you have a covariance of this preference shocks, what you're gonna have is that you're gonna break down the IID assumptions that allows you to construct the maximum likelihood estimator. And this means reduces the number of degrees of freedom that you have, but doesn't misspecify necessarily the parameter estimates. What it does is that you cannot open up these joint probabilities as a product of marginals, right? And therefore, what you're going to have is that you're going to have chunks of joint probabilities that are much coarser than the individual level probability that you use for the construction of the likelihood. But this is a problem that in maximum likelihood is very easy to fix. I can play with heteroscedasticity. You were talking about the different sigma squares. We can deal with that even in maximum likelihood. We can allow for a general structure of covariance. That's not going to generate the type of biases that your discussion was giving. It is going to generate effects in terms of nonlinearities, but not in terms of changing means. That's the only point of the discussion that I think it's a little bit debatable. To me, there are a couple of things here that are real jewels, like this idea that we need to rethink the share of polarization in votes. Obviously, this is something that I think it's super important and it's not done well as of now. And so we're going to take that kind of suggestion at heart. I like this last slide that is still up there. It has, such the placebo thing is something that is super easy to do and super interesting as an alternative. And also, we should be able to show that the estimates of party discipline change drastically when you start messing up the leaders, and you should see whether that particular, our model fits the data best, given that particular choice of leaders. So there is also a specification, a model selection part of that I think it's interesting, that comes from using these placebo leaderships. The idea of looking at asymmetries and the relative strength of Lyndon Johnson, that seems to me something that we can discuss in terms of context. I'm a little bit against picking and choosing certain data points because they don't fit my priors. So, I mean, maybe we can.
That wasn't a criticism. That's just a fun thing I like to point out is that every time I've seen an estimate of the Lyndon Johnson effect, it's been lower than a Republican effect. So I just wanted to bash Robert Caro. This is the only reason I mentioned.
All right. But thanks again, and I'll let Nathan fill in the rest of the discussion if he's around.
Thanks so much. Honestly, I won't have too much to add. Also, I want to leave some time for questions. So just really like to profusely thank Nolan for taking the time to engage again with our work and for this presentation. Especially there are, some key points that we had ourselves been thinking about. I'll just highlight, as Chad during the presentation had given a caveat about how we're still trying to get the right idea of share of polarization once you include party discipline in two-dimensional models. It is not as easy, I think, conceptually to think, especially because of these differences that were changed to the literature, and this really helps us push forward, and especially the sensitivity as well to leaders and non-leaders of these participant parameters. I think that would help really illustrate not only geometrically, as we have been doing before, of what parties are doing in this variation of one direction against the other, but really another margin which those results will hold. And so, yeah, so there's food for thought. So we'll keep working on it and think carefully about these points. So thank you so much.
No, you're welcome.
Okay, so if you want to ask a question, raise your hand or type into the Q&A box. Let me ask one, and that is that you look at Nolan was suggesting actually using party leadership votes from Cox and McCubbins, where you actually take a look at those votes in which the two major leaders on each part from each party oppose each other. So you sort of use that kind of language, and you focus on majority leader, if he voted, if the whip voted. But all through your paper, it's really about Republicans versus Democrats. And Cox and McCubbins, it's about majority parties versus minority parties. And there's theoretical reasons why the majority should have more power, at least in the House, right, with regard to whipping, right? They control the agenda. They have, a bigger war chest of goodies to use to reward or punish members, at least prior to the last 10 or 15 years, I suppose. So one way you might think a little bit about some of these things is to reconceptualize, or could be an extension, right? And really think about, to what extent does the majority have a clear whipping advantage over the minority when it comes to historical periods, when it comes to one chamber versus the other, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so we actually we did think about that in terms of just trying to take our. So one thing we did is we tried to take our estimates of discipline and just regress them on like whether you're the majority or not. The problem is, we have only 92 observations, so it's very hard with our limited time series to pick up anything there. And in fact, if I recall, we didn't pick up much, which is why it's not in the paper. I mean, because we didn't pick up much, but we also can't say it's zero. We can't say anything.
But are you proceeding under the assumption that the two parties have, the Republicans and the Democrats, regardless of when we're talking, and whether one is in the majority or not, have similar abilities?
No, because each Congress, you're going to get a new discipline for each party. So Congress by Congress, so that's gonna absorb any difference in majority minority, right? So like, if the Republicans are a majority in this Congress but not the next one, they're going to have two different discipline parameters. We're not making any assumptions about discipline across parties being the same or anything along those lines.
Okay, so there's also no learning at all, right? So if the Democrats are in control for 40 straight years, they're not learning anything about.
But again, we're going to estimate it separately. So I mean, if you think they're learning and they're getting better, you should see it going up. And then when they so your story is that consecutively, if they're in power for a while, you should see it going up. And then, if they lose, then it should drop. We haven't looked at that, but again, we could look at such a story based on our estimates. Yeah, we allow for such a thing.
So do you imagine that whipping is a function of the size of the parties at any point in time?
Yeah, I think that's another thing we looked at. Nathan can jump in because he was the one that was running those regressions, but we looked at a number of things.
Yeah, so I'll emphasize that I think one of the advantages of our approach is really our identification is really leveraging that we can recover Congress by Congress parameters, so those party disciplines per Congress. And in some way, we are leaving the search for correlation of how these party disciplines evolve, how the ideology evolve over time, because we're covering Congress by Congress. We're leaving it somewhat open for us to investigate a bit more of theories of party behavior. So towards the end of the paper, and more recently, we've been trying to, now that we consider these to be robust findings across these different assumptions, to try to investigate what are the theories of party behavior that have existed that are compatible with that or not. So we've investigated, for example, the discussion of as party discipline really related to majority size. Now there's, in one direction, there's in political science that our understanding says yes, and there is also another side that says not as much. For example, it could be not as much because you require, so if I'm not mistaken, so the pivotal politics type theory says, oh, it also depends on the president, it also depends on filibuster and other forms of majority. So it's not just simply a fifth majority. We've tried running those regressions. We're a bit constrained by the sample size. So it's 46 per party, and we can't just simply embed majority size without controlling for these additional factors. So at this point, we wanted to provide, say, really push on identification of these trends, what type of compatible theories like conditional party government we can say. There are others that are still open that hopefully when we get estimates from the House, which have a little bit more, even more data, or more Congress come back, we can come back to these theories and even leave it to additional research. I know, Nolan and one of my colleagues at UH, Boris, have done a lot on like a state legislation. So there might be more information that can be used in those dimensions.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you.
So you start, I mean, this goes back to a point that Nolan made at the bottom one of his slides. You start at 1927 because that's when you can formally identify a couple of these leaders.
That's right. So actually, if you go in Democratic and Republican leaderships, a lot of these leadership positions, especially in the Senate, were not defined until the early 1920s. Some of the House that were defined, they vary a lot in what it means. So, I mean, in the early 1900s, 1910, there are reforms about what leadership means, the position that they can take. So it's actually, we have some description in the paper that it's really in 1927 that we have systematic definitions for both parties, for the Senate and especially the House. In fact, there was a period, I think, in around the 1910s that there's missing data on who was actually leadership, I think, for the Democrats.
Yeah.
So it's just harder to deal with, which is, on the one hand, we can now benefit from the leadership positions to get this variation. On the other hand, we're also constrained from going even further back than 1920.
I think you should at least be able to push that back 20 years, 25 years for the House, right? We should be able to identify major leaders around 1900. And that at least allows you to kind of answer Nolan's question about the U-shape, right? To see if there was actually a U-shape at the beginning of that time series, because that's really where, when we talk about historical polarization, we're really talking about like 1890 to 1910, right? That 20-year period, which used to be kind of the high point before, I don't know, 2010, something like that. Okay, Francesco's typing an answer to the anonymous attendee. I see.
I totally agree with that, Jeff. I mean, if we can go back even 10, 15 more years in one of the chambers, it's really gonna, it's gonna, I thought that too when I was creating the slides and looking at them, like, well, yeah, it's unfortunate cut off just where it did. You just want to go a little bit farther back.
And the additional issue with the House case, so the Senate, I don't think there's a way really, but the House case, we're also limited by as you go further back, you exponentially increase as well the number of parameters estimated. So there's hundreds of new Congress members times 2 plus hundreds of bills coming in. And so that's why we couldn't really pursue the 2D House model yet. And that's really where this would leverage, but you're right that we can investigate the 1D first.
I think we should look at, because we could do the 1D House going farther back if yeah.
Do you think, I mean, these are more abstract questions now, but do you think whipping means the same thing in 1930 versus 2020? Do you think that concept can travel across time? Is it the same?
I'm probably not the one to take a stab at it. I mean, whipping is an old thing, right? Like it comes from the parliament, right? So it's like, yeah, it goes farther back than 1900, but I'm not familiar enough with all the ins and outs of the U.S. Congress to know whether that kind of thing would have changed much.
Do you think the effectiveness of whipping should increase in roll call votes, or should it decrease in roll call votes? Right, so you move from a Senate that has 100 roll calls to a Senate that has 1,000. Whipping requires some amount of energy, right? Some amount of whatever, right? That we're using up. Was it just a lot easier to whip when there were many fewer roll calls? I mean, one of the things that you notice when you plot the roll calls is the move to electronic voting, right around 1970, right, when the number of roll calls just gets really huge. And you hear all the time that members are voting on things that they have no clue about, right? Is whipping simply more effective because information is scarce relative to the number of votes that are actually being considered?
I think that's
an interesting question.
yeah, it's a very interesting. I mean, I guess one question I would have is how many? So there's many more roll calls. Is there many more important roll calls, or is there like 100 things that people care about, and a few other under things that are less important?
So if I can interject, it's everything about the organization of parties, I think it's a little bit up in the air in the sense that there is a lot of latent stuff that we don't know about, right? Now, cost may be going down or up, benefits may be going down or up, so we really don't know about that. What I think is important is that our measure kind of picks up very well what has happened since the 80s, and particularly since the 90s, with very strong kind of adversarial position of some of these party leaders. And the technology that they use for achieving that is a little bit of a mystery. I mean, was it Tom DeLay, a particular ruthlessness, or was it something about, Gingrich's ability of kind of focusing on adversarial narratives? Both were whips, both knew exactly how to twist arms. So I think this is where, in a sense, a lot of the research in political science could go once you have a way of opening this black box or getting some information about what's happening within the parties. You see, I think that's the thing about Congress that possibly has the biggest bang for the buck in terms of, where should we go with this, and what kind of problems this stuff generates.
So the anonymous attendee is writing back to you. I was less concerned about misspecification than trying to understand what is ultimately driving this. One account is that parties are a combination of issue publics. The more unrelated issues they take on in their bundle, the more ideological they look and the more whipping is needed. So this has something to do with complexity, right? I suppose, right? The complexity of the ideology itself.
Yeah, the multidimensionality of the problem is something that we actually had to spend a considerable amount of time in this paper. We didn't in the previous paper. It's something that is, I think, in political science well understood, that 2 dimensions is not necessarily the right approach. But even in economics, I mean, if you look at the old Heckman-Snyder paper, that paper says it should be 7 dimensions. Using this kind of factor analysis, principal components. So I think this multidimensionality issue is a little bit, it's very complicated to handle. And in fact, I mean, our paper shows how hard it is even in 2 dimensions to constructively prove identification. So I take the point of the anonymous attendee, but it's kind of, it's very hard for us to deal with multiple dimensions.
Okay, the anonymous attendee has now identified herself.
Oh, okay. It's okay. You don't have to.
So let me suggest. So one counterfactual, right? Let's say as you're finding greater polarization over time because of whipping, right? Let's imagine that we have, at the same time that Republican leaders and Democratic leaders are agreeing on a direction for votes, right? And they're opposing directions. Let's imagine that the impetus for Republican and Democratic donors are going up considerably. So the donors themselves are caring a lot more over time. And they're whipping from the outside via dollars, campaign dollars. is it leadership effects that are driving that difference that we're observing, or is it something outside?
My take would be we can't disentangle those things.
But
So
you're attributing it to one thing, right? To the former.
We are. Yeah. No, that's a good question. I mean, that's something to think about, whether you could get at that somehow. But to the extent that all the parties, the members of the party, are voting similarly, I mean, you'd have to have the same kind of, which is what you said, you'd have to have the same kind of pulling apart and pushing in the same direction. But if you had that from external sources, I don't think you could.
Nolan, could you use the Bonica scores to get at that at all?
I mean, they have the advantage that they're outside Congress, but they have the disadvantage that you
only have a few years, right?
You only have a few years, and like the donors may or may not be. The connection between the donors and what the party wants is not always clear. Now, I mean, I made the point that donor networks are can be an important reason why these errors are correlated across party, but I don't know whether you can get at that strictly by using the Bonica scores.
And Jeff, by the way, my understanding, personally, of Bonica scores is that they can have high correlation, but within party, it's hard to differentiate the performance of ideology within party, because a lot of the donors donate to multiple of those same members. And so I completely agree, Jeff, that might be something going on. There's something very strategic. So as a party becomes more effective, do you donate more because they become more effective? So in some sense, I think that's being loaded onto a lot of the parameters here. And decoupling, having more theory, something that can help disentangle that, could be useful in the future.
Yeah, so Adam's tried to address that, right? The within party problem in a more recent LSQ article. But I think it's still.
Well, one of the big problems, which is just not super addressable, is the fact that progressive donors are more inclined to vote on environment and gender and sexuality than on economic redistribution, whereas within Congress, Democratic members are casting lots of votes on the extent of economic redistribution, unions, etc. So there's a mismatch on the left between who votes and who donates that causes some important differences between the Bonica scores on the left and the ideal points of congressional members.
So I guess one way to look at it is like this paper is a step in the direction of trying to disentangle ideology from party correlated things, which I guess the what I'm hearing you say is those things could be discipline, but just like ideology could be ideology, or it could be something else. So we're taking one step to split these things apart, but there's going to be hopefully more steps to try and figure out like exactly what's going on in this party part. So that I take that as a very good point. We should definitely say there could be some other things that are in this discipline thing. That's
one party, or that's one paper per step, right?
Yeah. I mean, splitting these two things apart was already, I think it's a step. Yeah.
So we're over time. Let me just take a look at this one comment that we got, could leaders have changed their behavior over time to ensure a small but ideologically consistent caucus versus a large but fractious caucus? Or do you think this does not matter? I guess this is really about just the strategy of leaders across time, right? And the things that they're interested in. I think you're, by definition, having to hold a lot of this stuff constant across time to be able to say anything more general, right? So whipping, there's nothing fundamentally different about what whipping means across time. There's not anything fundamentally different about what a leader is trying to do across time.
That's why I'm not sure I agree, because again, we're estimating, there's no assumption about how this discipline parameter should evolve over time. We're estimating it Congress by Congress. There's nothing tying one to anything else. So it could have been 0 for a long time. It could have So I don't think
But you are assuming that the whip is the whip, right? That the whipping is done by this formal position called the whip. Right?
By the
Not
leader.
Well, leaders, right? The majority leader and the whip, right? That these mean the same thing over time.
What we're assuming specifically is that the leader / whip's vote tells us what they wanted. So if at one period in time the leader and whip were voting against the thing they wanted, that would be a big problem. But that would be a weird story.
Yeah. I remember Dan Lipinski came to one of the Congress and History conferences a number of years ago, and somebody asked him a question. So Dan represented a district in Chicago, House district in Chicago, up until very recently, where he was defeated in his primary. And Dan was asked, and he has a PhD in political science, right? So he was asked, well, what is different about House politics relative to what you thought about, what you were taught about House politics in your PhD program at Duke? And one of the first thing he said was, I'm being whipped all the time by all kinds of people, right? So there's not just the whip and his team, but I'm being whipped by individuals. I'm being whipped by groups. I'm being, essentially persuaded all the time to vote in a certain direction. So I don't know if that, if you imagine that world exists, I don't know if that introduces any confounds at all, or if that makes you reinterpret the results that you have in a certain way.
I think reinterpret, because again, we're going to be able to split the what is unique to you as a member and the ways you're getting pulled versus the way your party's getting pulled. That's essentially what our paper, now that I'm thinking about this from all the things you're saying, that's essentially what we can disentangle. That's what we can split apart. If different things are pulling the party in different ways, I don't think we can pull that out as neatly.
Yeah. So this was a lot of fun. I'm glad you guys could come and present. I'm glad that I had the foresight to ask Nolan if he could be the discussant on this. And I think this format works really well. It probably doesn't work as well for questions and answers, right, from the audience. But I can work on that going forward. But it was great to see the paper, and I'm glad that you
thanks a lot,
gave us
Jeff.
the opportunity to showcase it.
Yeah, from our perspective, this was invaluable. Nolan, we hadn't met before. Thanks very much. Super helpful.
Thanks,
Lots of things for us to go off and think about.
Yeah, and thanks for the attendees who showed up. I think there are 11 still in in the Zoom right now of the 35 that started. Thanks again, and thanks for making this first pipe workshop of the spring 2021 semester a success. And thanks to Aubrey Hicks and Ann Johnson at the Bedrosian Center for making this easy for me, because somebody has to make it easy for me if we're going to do this. And have a good rest of your Tuesday, everyone.